Well, good. It's great to be back this morning, be with you. And it's always dangerous, at a conference like this to teach on the Sabbath because you want to talk about it, but you don't want everybody to actually do it, and you want people to show up. So some of you came, and I'm really glad for that. Thank you for being here and not taking me too literally. Glad you're here. This morning, we're going to take some time and get really practical. Yesterday's talk was really kind of at a theological level, right? We talked about the Bible, Scripture, and what the Bible has to say about this idea of the Sabbath. We looked at the creation story, the law. We looked at the life of Jesus and how for the church, we orient everything towards this future dimension of hope, which is the eternal Sabbath, which is heaven. But this morning, I think it's really important that we take some of the ideas that we wrestled with yesterday and actually start to think about how we do them. And yesterday I made a kind of fleeting comment that I've never met a pastor who after Sunday walked away from Sunday and went, "Oh, that was a refreshing experience." The truth is, Sunday is if Sunday has to be our Sabbath, we're toast. We're toast. So we need to wrestle with for a few minutes the really practical sides of the Sabbath, because for pastors, Sabbath keeping is a really challenging and difficult enterprise to enter into. It turns out Jesus actually got really practical about the Sabbath himself. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus encountered some religious people, some Pharisees and Sadducees. The text reads, Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, Jesus was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. And I should point out, one of the unique features of the religious people, the Pharisees and Sadducees in the Gospels, is that they always on the Sabbath are watching what Jesus is doing, which at the end of the day is ultimately the definition of legalism, is spending your day off watching how everybody else spends their day off. So if your notion of Sabbath keeping is essentially ensuring that all of your boundaries are met in every parishioner's life and every person in your city's life, if everybody else has to live up to your standard of the Sabbath, then you have misunderstood the Sabbath. They're always watching Jesus to see what he's going to do. And it turns out, I was sharing yesterday with an inquiring mind, Jesus actually broke the Sabbath. Now, he didn't break the biblical Sabbath. He didn't break the Mosaic understanding of the Sabbath. Jesus actually fulfilled that part of the Sabbath. But Jesus broke consistently, and I would say intentionally, the religious and Pharisaical understanding of the Sabbath. In essence, Jesus loved breaking their understanding of tradition to enter into a conversation about what was important. Okay. So Jesus here walks into a religious person's home, into a prominent Pharisee, and they're all watching him. The same thing happens when Jesus is walking through the grain fields, picking grains with his disciples. What are the Pharisees doing? They're on the edge of the field watching what Jesus is going to do. Okay? If you're a referee on the Sabbath, you're working. Not an actual referee, I hope you understand. Not a sports referee, but if you're spending your time ensuring everybody else is doing it properly, you've misunderstood the Sabbath. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus asked the Pharisee and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" Jesus asks. But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him away. And then Jesus asked them, "Listen, if one of you has a son, or you have an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?" And they had nothing to say. And what we see Jesus do here, he's being intentionally difficult. What Jesus is doing here is he is setting up these Pharisees and the Sadducees to learn a really big lesson about the practicalities of Sabbath. Because, friends, the truth of the matter is we don't serve the Sabbath serves us. That God did not give us the Sabbath to be a new master. We have one master, it's Jesus. And the Sabbath serves us. A few years ago, I was sitting around a campfire, actually in Blacksburg, Virginia, where I was at just a couple days ago with the North Atlantic Foursquare District. I was with a friend who was an admiral in the Navy for something like 30 years. We're sitting around the fire late one evening with his daughter, a friend of mine, and another person I just met. We were sitting around talking about his experience. He had all of these stories about his years in the military. And we got talking a little bit about what some of the lessons that he learned over the years. And he was telling me about this really kind of mysterious truth in the military that the Navy actually for years has really struggled to understand. And the mystery is this. When you compare World War II and Vietnam, and the soldiers when they returned from World War II and Vietnam, there's a very big difference between soldiers who came back from World War II after fighting Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. When they came back, it was very different than when the soldiers from Vietnam came back. And he was explaining that for the soldiers, for example, the soldiers who came back from Vietnam, levels of PTSD were sky high. Drug abuse was sky high. Abuse of wives was sky high when they came back. Depression and suicide were sky high. And so when the soldiers came back from Vietnam, there was the soldiers were in a very poor health. Whereas for the World War II folks who came back, in most occasions when those folks came back, PTSD rates were quite low. Now, of course, at the time they didn't know how to necessarily understand PTSD in the same way that they did during Vietnam, but there weren't near as many people that were diagnosed with PTSD. Abuse rates were far lower. They came back and just had a bunch of kids, just a ton of them. We have a whole generation named after that wave of time. And drug usage was actually quite low after World War II. And in sort of Navy history, they've wrestled with this. What was unique? What was different about Vietnam from World War II? And some might say, well, the violence was worse. But I don't think that there's any room to say that the violence in Vietnam was worse. Some of the stories from World War II, to me, seem 10 times harder than Vietnam. Of course, both were horrific stories. But what was it? My friend was telling me that they have a theory. There are historians, sort of Navy historians, who've written about this. And the theory is really quite simple. And that is that there's one fundamental difference between the soldiers from Vietnam and the soldiers from World War II. And the one difference is this. For the soldiers in Vietnam, they would get off at the end of their time of service, they would get off of the battlefield and would get onto a plane and would fly home and would be home within about 48 hours. And so they would go from the field of battle, fighting the Viet Cong and being at war, hand-to-hand combat, and being back with their family and their kids within a 48-hour period. Whereas in World War II, what did you do? For the soldiers that came back, they didn't fly home. They got on a boat for 30 days, and they came home. And most sort of medical historians in the Navy have argued that the reason that was important was for 30 days, soldiers in World War II came back on a boat with their friends, and what would they do for 30 days on a boat? They would talk, they would cry, they would reflect, they would process. That is a metaphor for our culture. When you remove space, when you remove the opportunity to be quiet, when you remove space to be silent, when you remove space to have friendships, when you remove that space, all of a sudden we start breaking down in our inner cores. I mean, that's a story of pastoral work, frankly. When you and I don't have time to process or be in front of Jesus, you know how well that works out for our parishioners. We get neurotic, we get controlling, We get mean. God has built human beings to need space. And Sabbath, at the end of the day, Sabbath has incredibly practical dimensions to it. It actually changes the way that we relate to one another. It changes the way that we know how to love one another. It changes the way, one could argue, and I'm not blaming the entirety of what is taking place in our culture right now, but our culture, it just feels, and older generations who are much older and wiser than I, it feels worse now than it's ever been. Part of me wonders if as a culture we simply don't know how to get along with each other because we haven't had time to be quiet and silent and be at peace with ourselves. And so all we know how to do is go on Twitter and beat people up. All we know how to do is get on Facebook and find everything wrong with everybody. We don't have time. I honestly think that there is a direct connection between our ability to rest and our capacity for empathy, compassion, and forgiveness. You remove Sabbath, your ability to forgive and be patient plummets. This gets really practical. I think there are 4 questions that every pastor needs to sort of ponder when they think about their Sabbath. These 4 questions. What does a Sabbath, number 1, what does a pastor's Sabbath look like? Number 2, what does a pastor do on the Sabbath? Number 3, what does a pastor do when church stuff comes up? Thank you so much. We're going to miss you. Thank you. There is a direct relationship between the ability to speak and having a dry throat. Okay, number 4, why does a pastor Sabbath? So ultimately, let's begin with this sort of first question for every pastor. And we're going to get really practical. What does a pastor's Sabbath actually look like? I think in order to accomplish that, I'd like to walk you through what our family does for a Sabbath. And again, I think a pastor's Sabbath is very different than just about anybody else's Sabbath because of the way that our rhythms work, the work that we do on Sunday, so on and so forth. What does a pastor's Sabbath actually look like? The first step is you got to do some planning ahead of time. Okay? Nobody accidentally Sabbaths in our culture. Nobody just wakes up and Sabbaths, particularly not pastors. We have to be thoughtful. We have to plan. We have to know in advance what we're going to be doing and how we're going to do it. And the reason is when you're a part of a community where people are dependent upon you for service, for love, for ministry, when you've got people in your church who are in the hospital and you're about to take a Sabbath, you got to think through these sorts of things. So the first thing you got to do is begin to plan. Well, what day are you going to Sabbath? What day are you going to Sabbath? It turns out in our family, we, for the last 5 years, have Sabbathed on Wednesdays. Wednesdays has served as a perfect day for us. And recently, because my son is now in kindergarten, we have moved our Sabbath to Saturday because we want to be able to Sabbath with our son. Now, that brings up all sorts of new problems. It's really hard to Sabbath on Saturday when you know you're preaching the next day. And it's really hard to know that the next day you're going to be thrown into this fiery furnace of ministry and there's going to be like no transition at all. Mondays are hard too. Here's why Mondays are hard. Mondays are hard is because you are literally coming off of a high. You are coming off an adrenaline high. There's phenomenal stuff being written by Archibald Hart at Fuller Seminary who talks about the relationship between pastors and their adrenaline addiction. And the truth is, almost every pastor is an adrenaline addict. True story. More pastors, so pastoral care, pastoral health, more pastors, a study was done a couple years ago to look at pastors' health, their well-being. More pastors have heart attacks between 5 and 9 a.m. on Monday morning than any other time in the week. And the reason is extremely practical. And that is that when you come off of your adrenaline high on Sunday, your heart rate starts getting back to normal, and the blood vessels, I've been told, I'm not a doctor, I'm a doctor, but not in medical terms. You want to talk about the Trinity, you're in good hands. You want me to deliver a baby, you're toast. That on the day that you go back to a normal rhythm, your blood vessels have been sort of enlarged, and then it goes back to its normal sort of smaller size, and it puts pastors at a very high risk of cardiac episodes. All of this, so when on Monday, Sabbathing on Monday is like, it's almost impossible because number one, you're coming off your adrenaline high, and then secondarily, everybody in the world wants to talk to you on Monday about problems from Sunday. Probably one of the greatest things that you can do to put yourself in a bad position to make bad decisions is go to church on Monday. Go to church when you're neurotic, and not only just neurotic and coming off your adrenaline high, but in your mind, you know everything wrong you did on Sunday. So you're going in now, you're sort of wondering, am I secure? Do people like me? Is my counsel going to fire me? All this stuff. Monday's a hard day. Saturday's hard. The truth, every day is hard to Sabbath. There is no ideal day to Sabbath. There is no ideal day to Sabbath. So the Jews, of course, it was on Saturday. And the reason for Christians that switched from Saturday to Sunday was between the years of Jesus' resurrection and the year 70. The Christians all worshiped, because they were all Jews, the Christians all worshiped, most of them were Jews, the Christians worshiped on Saturday with their Jewish communities, and then on Sunday worshiped the resurrected Jesus, and that became the Christian Sabbath. And in the year 70, when the church and the synagogue split, the church basically took up Sunday as the day of rest. And of course, in the history of the church, you've got different traditions. Some people celebrate it on Saturday, some people celebrate it on Sunday. I think what is important is this. I think Paul makes it really clear in one of his letters where he says, I want to admonish you to not bicker about the new moons, don't bicker about what festivals are, and don't bicker about the day of the Sabbath. I actually think Paul, in the New Testament in general, gives a sense of elasticity to what the Sabbath entails. And so my sort of principle is that it's 1 in 7. 1 day in 7. That 1 day in 7, you take a day to rest and be with God and be with people. Now, it's going to happen where you're going to have a week where you miss your Sabbath, and that's going to happen. And the good news about Jesus is he still likes you. And he'll always like you. But for your well-being, I think it's really good if you're going to miss a Sabbath 1 week, the next week, take 2 days. Plan ahead. If your church has a retreat, you know you're going to miss it, plan ahead and do 2 days the next week. So you got to begin with this simple sort of plan. Like, what are you going to do? What day are you going to have? Taking in mind your kids, your church. Now, another thing to consider is the Jews had this brilliant idea called the Day of Preparation. And the day before Sabbath, as they were walking through the desert, God would put this manna on the floor of the desert, and they would walk through and pick up bread that they would eat every day. But God, of course, in the desert said, don't take too much bread. Make sure that there's enough bread for everybody. You were not to collect extra bread, except for 1 day. You were to collect extra bread on 1 day, the day before the Sabbath. If you were to collect extra bread, extra manna before, and it wasn't the Sabbath, then ultimately the bread, as you will remember, would rot with worms. But if you collected extra for the day of Sabbath, God would bless it. This became the idea of the day of preparation. In our family, which is Friday, about 7 hours, 6 hours, we take out of the Friday day and we prepare for the Sabbath. We do our dishes. I mow the lawn. That is a ritualistic must-do for me. In a world of pastoral care where nothing is ever done, I need something that I can stand back and go, look, I did it. Something. Because you've never walked away from church and gone, oh, we're all done. That's great. All finished. It's natural that you need something to do. Do your lawn. Go to the bank. Go grocery shopping. Think about your pets. What do they need on the Sabbath? Think about all the things, because the truth is, I can't remember one time that I have effectively been able to rest in a really crazy, messy house. But that's a temperamental thing for me, is I need to think in advance, how can my house be prepared? Another thing to think about on your day of preparation is, what is going to happen if there's an emergency on the Sabbath? Who are people going to be able to get a hold of? Who is somebody that perhaps on your day of rest can take the calls on that day? Okay. Now that you've sort of planned and you've done the day of preparation, the next stage is actually starting the Sabbath. This is where it gets really fun. So for us, on Friday evenings, I come home from work and we have these Sabbath candles, these 2 Sabbath candles in our living room. And my son loves the Sabbath candles. My son loves to be the one that gets to light them. I guess every 6-year-old's they're all pyromaniacs. All kids love burning stuff. So he loves to be the one that lights the candles. Usually he'll light the Sabbath candles 4 or 5 times, blow them out, light them up again, keep going back and forth. He loves it. And we'll light the Sabbath candles. It's the official beginning of the Sabbath. And we will sing a song to each other. It's super nerdy, but everybody in our family understands it, and it marks the beginning of the Sabbath. And this is the way it goes. You sing every name of the person in your house. So in our family it goes, Shabbat Shalom to Mama, Shabbat Shalom to Papa, Shabbat Shalom to Elliot. And Elliot has this tradition. He'll just start naming all the other things that he can think of. Shabbat Shalom to the chickens. Shabbat Shalom to the refrigerator. Shabbat Shalom. Last week, Shabbat Shalom to my dirty clothes. Right. Love it. He's always coming up with something to Shabbat Shalom. He loves Shabbat Shalom, which means Sabbath peace. And when the Sabbath is begun, it's a ritual. My wife and I will turn to this little demonic device right here. And we will do something that all week long we've wanted to do, but we haven't had the capacity to do, nor the ability to do. And that is, and again, this is something not every pastor knows is a reality, but it turns out that, this little button right up here, which can turn, you can do that, and then, but here's the deal. If you hold it down for like 5 seconds, it will turn off, right? But it's important to note that when it turns off, the people who designed this little thing knew what they were doing. Because as you turn it off, it will flash a little apple with a bite taken out of it, like it's the Garden of Eden. And that you've literally been living at the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Friends, we have replaced the fruit in the Garden of Eden with a whole new fruit. And the problem is, friends, this thing is probably the greatest enemy to the Sabbath for any one of us. This thing is demonic. We need it, unfortunately. It's not actually demonic, but it's so pervasive and difficult to get out of. I mean, this thing is literally the world in our pocket. It's in our pocket. The world is, and the only time in history the world has ever been in anybody's pocket. You've got the whole world in your hands in this thing. The whole world. And we think, of course, as Americans, we think that the more information we have and knowledge that we have about everybody and everything that we need, that the happier we're going to be. Studies are consistently showing right now that there is a direct relationship between social media and depression. The average 16-year-old in America will spend 6 to 7 hours a day in front of a screen. Don't tell me we were created for that. And depression rates are skyrocketing. One could even argue that the more knowledge and information you have in your mind, the more depressed you're going to get. In fact, Albert Einstein once said that. In his final paper that he ever wrote, the final statement on scientific knowledge, Albert Einstein wrote, "I have come to conclude that the people who I know who know the most are the gloomiest." In fact, friends, for anybody in this world who has traveled to other parts of this world, the people who often have the least intellectual knowledge are the most joyful people in the world. This idea, friends, that the more you know, the happier you're going to be is a lie. Your joy is not connected to the information you know. Your joy is connected to knowing your Creator. That's where you get your joy. But we eat from the tree of knowledge all the time, don't we? We think this makes us happy. We buy a new one of these, and for like a day, it's like we got saved all over again. And then the day afterwards, we're like, okay, my life still stinks. Because it doesn't save us, and it can't save us. Turning this thing off is critical. It's critical. Have a ritual. Take a moment before the Sabbath to turn it off together. And it's important, I should point out as well, it's important because there is a really big difference. Eugene Peterson talks about this at great length. There is a really big difference between a Sabbath day and a day off. And here's why. A day off, Eugene Peterson argues, is a day that we are at home, but our minds are at work. What this thing does is it allows us to be somewhere. Have you ever seen a millennial and they're sitting at the table with you and they've got a blank look on their face and their hands are below the desk or something and they're looking at you like, okay. They did that in the 60s, you'd be really concerned, right? Like that's, what are you doing? They're texting. They're texting. Friends, there's a whole generation of people who know how to be in the room but not be in the room. That is not the way we've been created to live. Turning this thing off actually gives you permission to be in the room that you're actually in. And this idea, Eugene Peterson says, most Americans, a day off is simply a day that we're at home, but we're thinking about work. But to think about work compulsively is actually to work. In fact, he says, Eugene Peterson, it's an acceptable cuss word, I think, but Eugene Peterson says that a day off is not a Sabbath at all. He calls a day off a bastard Sabbath. It is an illegitimate Sabbath where we're just scheming about work. What are we going to do when we get back? But our minds need a day of rest too. Our minds need a break. So we turn our phones off. We turn our phones off. There have been times on the Sabbath that I have needed to give my wife my phone so that I couldn't find it. Because I am an addict, and you are too. We go to bed. Love waking up in the morning on the Sabbath. Nobody makes their bed. My son is freed from one day from his Pharaoh father to just let it be. And Elliot, my son, will come and wake me up. Now, on the Sabbath, my wife, usually I try to make it my goal that she gets to sleep in on the Sabbath. So Elliot will come up and get me, and we'll come downstairs. And my son and I, it's this family ritual that, you ask my son what Sabbath is about, and this is what he would say it's all about, is we make every Sabbath, we make pancakes. Every Sabbath. Pancakes and bacon. And anybody in the room that thinks that I'm arguing for some sort of return to the law or Pharisaicals, or I eat far too much bacon for that to be a possibility, friends. Pancakes, bacon, coffee with honey in it. And we sit there. By this point, the wife has come downstairs. She smells the bacon. She comes down. And we sit around the table, man. And for like an hour, we just stuff our face. My son, it's interesting. My son can tell fake maple syrup from real maple syrup. He knows the difference. We've tried to give him the fake stuff because it's cheaper. And he's like, that's not it. That's not it. He knows the real stuff. And he just pours it on. Oh, my goodness. And we actually do that because years ago I read about this tradition that in the Jewish tradition, it would be very common on the morning of the Sabbath that the fathers would get up an hour early or before the kids got up, and they would go out and get a spoon of honey for every child in the house. And the goal would be that as the kids would eat that honey, they would never forget the sweetness of God's rest. And my goal is when I'm dead in 70 years, and my son is walking down the street, and he just hears somebody say the word Sabbath, that he just starts to drool. Like Pavlov, Pavlov's dog. Just ding, oh, food, it's that bacon. I want my son, if my son grows up and does whatever with his life, my goal is that he will not be able to live his life and forget that God invites him to his sweet rest. So we eat pancakes. And almost always after the pancakes, we do a movie. Now, I put that in quotes because my son gets to watch a movie. My wife and I take a nap